including being a spokesperson and chief strategist of the South African Communist Party until his departure in 2010. Also on our discussants, we have Mashile Phalane, who is a community activist as well. He's very passionate about community development. He initiated several community development at the Batlhabine community. He is a member of the Mining and Environmental Community Justice Network. He's an editor of the local newspaper called the iNews, and an environmentalist with the courage to protect and conserve natural resources and biodiversity. We are live streaming this seminar on YouTube, so please follow us on Facebook as well as Twitter for updates. And without wasting any more time, we'll give about 20 minutes to Jackie to speak, and we'll then open it to our discussants who will speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we open it up to the floor for comments and questions. Over to you, Jackie.
Well, thank you. I'll try and talk for less than that so that we can have a real conversation in which everyone will participate, or I hope so, with comments and criticisms as well as questions. What I'm going to try to do is to talk briefly about the Mabola struggle, using coal as a signifier of how some people conceptualize our era as the Anthropocene, and I'm using cranes as the signifier of a very different era, the Ecocene, which was started about 56 million years ago. Difficult to think in that sort of time span, but I do think we have to be thinking very big about the crisis we're in and what we're facing. Now, the Mabola Protected Area is situated near Wakkerstroom in Mpumalanga, and it was declared in January 2014, and it raises many interesting questions and issues which I'm only really going to have time to point to. It's a very beautiful place, as Dineo will confirm. We went there together earlier this year. It's an area composed mainly of sensitive wetlands, grasslands, and it supports threatened plants, animals, and especially rare and threatened species of birds, including cranes. It's also one of the most critical watersheds in South Africa. It's called a freshwater hotspot, and it's one of 22 such water sources that produce half the country's fresh water. So it's clearly a very, very important ecological area in which there are also people living in great hardship. Now, the Mabola Protected Area was established in terms of the National Environmental Management Protected Act in 2014, mainly, I think, to protect it as a water source. However, this act also creates the possibility, if the ministers responsible for the environment and for mining both grants written permission for mining to take place in this particular spot. And this is what happened when the late Edna Molewa, who was the Environmental Affairs Minister, gave permission to an Indian mining company, Ather Africa, to their proposal to develop an underground coal mine within the protected area. That was in August 2015, followed 3 months later by Mineral Resources Minister Mosebenzi Zwane. Now, Zwane is a particularly controversial figure in the whole state capture saga, and I wish I had more time to talk about him. He is alleged, well, he definitely—
You are breaking, Jackie.
Okay, sorry. Is that coming right now? He went to Zurich to alleged have to put pressure on Glencore to sell their Optimum mine to the Guptas. He's also associated with the Estina dairy scandal and with the asbestos scandal. Mark Swilling, in his latest book, maintains that one of Zuma's key strategies was to capture the mining sector, and his key ally was who he termed the politically incompetent, bombastic Minister of Mines. So much for Zwane. Now, Africa is a registered, it's now called Utaka Energy, and it's a private company registered in India. Its Black Empowerment partner, BEE partner, as required by law, is the Bashubili Trust, which includes 2 of President Zuma's nephews, and none of the other members live in Bokestrom or even Mpumalanga. AFA company claimed that the underground mine would operate for 15 years. It would produce low-grade coal, which would be sold to Eskom or exported via Richards Bay, and would generate revenue of at least 1 billion rand during the first 10 years of operation. The mine would also benefit the community, particularly through the creation of 500 jobs once it was fully operational. And in several public meetings, spokesman for AFA, for the mining corporation, claimed that these would involve much higher wages than the farmers in the area paid their workers, and people were told everyone will own a motor car, unquote. That was told to both Dineo and I when we visited earlier this year. Now, the key strategy of AFA Africa is to create divisions in the local community, damaging social cohesion, and in the process, as someone said, turning Bokestrom into a battlefield. And the main component of this divisive strategy is the false promise of jobs signifying development. It's a strategy that is not specific to the Bokestrom area. It's a common tactic used by coal corporations, especially in relation to employment wrapped up in the discourse of development. For example, speaking of Somkhele in KZN, where the coal mining company is trying to extend its mine on community-owned land bordering the Khotluwi-Umfolozi Park, an informant told, that was Victor and I, who visited in 2018, they were told that this informant said, that's the company, look for fault lines in the community and then fill them with money and shatter the unity, which I think was putting it very well. This is linked to mobilizing support from local government officials. In the case of Mabola, local officials such as the local ward councillor, the MEC for Agriculture, Rural Development, Land and Environmental Affairs, right up to the Premier of Mpumalanga, have all been vociferous supporters of coal mining in a protected area. Vusi Songwe has said the proposed mining project would, quote, enhance developing export markets for South African products and services and the severely impoverished community of the area. Now, this is not the only tactic that coal mining corporations are using in Mpumalanga and KZN, where most of the coal mines are situated. At the same time, there's widespread threats, intimidation, and violence against anti-coal mining activists and such threats are accelerating. It's the most dramatic example of this is, well, first at the struggle at Kolobeni, the Kolobeni people struggling against an Australian mining company, and between 2020 and 2018, at least 12 opponents of the mining are believed to have been assassinated. And that included the chairperson of the Amadiba Crisis Committee, Bazuka Radebi, in 2006. The present chair of the Amadiba Crisis Committee lives with bodyguards and constant threats. In addition to violence and threats and intimidation, attempted bribery is very common. And you will have read of the what's happened in Somkhele, where there's very strong resistance to the expansion of Tendeli mine. And this led to the recent assassination of Mafakili, the vice chair of the Umfolozi Community Environmental Justice Organization, who opposed the expansion of the mine, which would destroy graves and displace a total of 145 families. One account is that a few days before her death, she stated her intention to write an affidavit about an offer of a bribe of 350,000 Rand to sign a memorandum of agreement with Tendeli Corporation. This happened also in the case of Kolobeni, where they established the Kolobeni Empowerment Company, formed by the Australian company that wanted and still does want to mine titanium. Another strategy has involved both establishing and founding and then supporting local organizations to support mining in these various places, in these conflicts between coal mining corporations and communities. In the case of the Wakkerstroom, a Volksrust-based civic organization called the Voice Community Representative Council was formed and claims to represent the majority of the people living in the area. And in addition to forming this organization, AFA Africa helped to organize a group of 65 pro-mine activists and bus them 300 kilometers from Volksrust to protest against the offices of the Law Corporation, which I'll talk about separately, in Johannesburg, maintaining that that organization was, in their words, blocking their job opportunities. And similarly, an official from the Endangered Wildlife Trust spoke about a meeting in Wakkerstroom, which was disrupted when AFA Africa bussed in hundreds of people, some of whom were armed. So they've got there's a very ugly picture of the manipulation of people and resources, a toxic atmosphere linked to a barrage of threats and intimidation from mining corporations. And the determination to pursue mining, I think, is illustrated by AFA's defiance of all the court rulings which have been brought against them, even that of the Constitutional Court. The most recent expression of this was an invitation published in pamphlets and on social media, inviting the public to celebrate what they called an Earthbreaking Ceremony on the 24th of March of this year. And they described this as, quote, a unique partnership between the community and Utaka Energy, as they're now called, and, unquote, and quote again, an exciting milestone involving a unique partnership and with refreshments and snacks, the Premier of Mpumalanga being the chief guest. Now, this is a project, it's part of a project that is an ongoing project in SWOP led by our friend and colleague Dineo, Skosana, and we have found that communities in many mining affected places are beginning to organize very effectively, largely with the help of environmental activists, such as the Center for Environmental Rights Groundwork and Earthlife Africa, mobilize against coal mining. But in the case of Wakkerstroom, it seems that the very toxic atmosphere and fear that people have of the violence and threats and intimidation coming from Africa, or Toga Energy as it's called, has inhibited people so that there is very widespread and intense support from the local Black community for the establishment of a coal mine in the Mabola Protected Area. Often this was qualified by the comment that this was the only job opportunity in sight. Now I speak a little tentatively because in other communities we've engaged with more depth, and we organized what we called exchange workshops, which included large numbers of people having collective discussion over long periods of time so that one could get a good sense of what was happening in the community. COVID and fear made that impossible, but discussions with many informants find that there is this support for coal, which is not unanimously true of other coal mining affected communities. There's a lot of self-organizing going on under the traveling discourse of environmental justice. But I think that what's happened in the Mabola case is that they have been largely successful in obtaining the support of the local Black population to build the coal mine, largely because it is the only possibility on the horizon of employment, but also there's a historical link between conservation and dispossession, which is also relevant and which Dineo is researching at the moment. For many Black South Africans, conservation is linked to dispossession, and thousands of people have been forcibly removed to create national parks as well as protected areas, and in the process have lost their land and their livelihoods. The Kruger National Park is the best known example, but there's also the Mapungubwe National Park, the St. Lucia Wetland Park, the Madikwe Game Reserve, and the Kliflui Mfolozi National Park. They all involve mass removals. And this is very important, almost always local communities have failed to benefit from their exclusion. So there's this tradition which has made it very difficult for environmental justice activists to be active in the area. People from groundwork have tried to organize community visits to Witbank, for example, and have found them up against real fear and tension, so that the main source of resistance is coming from a coalition established by the Center for Environmental Rights, which is the best example we have in South Africa of judicial activism, which is teaching people, and it goes further than teaching people about their constitutional rights, equipping people with the understanding and the confidence to challenge the local authorities and protect what is their own. But it's an area in which people have very, very little. There is a desperate need for employment. Over 80% of youth in the Mabola area are unemployed, and most people live a very precarious existence, dependent on social grants, and employment opportunities are limited to road repairs for the public works, which pays 858 cents a day, or very low wage employment by local farmers. And a local activist spoke to well, emphasize several characteristics of the community in terms of this extreme poverty and hunger. Quote, people live on mealie meal and water, she said. And then went on to say, there is a desperation for jobs of any kind, confusion and anxiety about the future, little information about the connection between mine closures and the climate crisis, or the debate about a just transition, and a highly racialized atmosphere. So there are no good relations between blacks and whites. Black people don't trust whites. And such racial animosity relates to the very widespread notion that environmental concerns are somehow contaminated by our historical record under apartheid, which prioritized threatened animals, plants, and wilderness areas and neglected the needs of people. This particular informant is the coordinator of the Mabola Alternative Group and said, we want to show the community that we don't need the mine in our area. We used to grow our own food and can do it again. This is now top priority for us local activists. But she talked about a sense, living with a sense of fear coming from mining supporters, and has experienced some ostracism because she started asking questions about their social labor plan, which has minimal spending on local needs. She said, one day I was followed by a car before a meeting. The guys just rolled up the window and looked at me. No one talked. They might have wanted to kill me. So what I think this points to is the success of others' intimidation tactics and their ideological tactics, which make it very difficult for environmental justice activists to organize in the area. And as I said, the only source of resistance is the judicial activism, which is trying to equip people to establish, to fight for their rights. Several informants talked about the potential of nature tourism around Wakkerstroom, as the area is inhabited by over 40 different bird species, including different varieties of cranes. Now, cranes are birds that come from another time, which is why I'm using them as a signifier of the another geological era, an era that is associated, as is the Anthropocene, with mass extermination. As Aldo Leopold wrote in 1937, our appreciation of the crane grows with the slow unraveling of earthly history. His tribe, as we now know, stems out of the remote Ecocene, and so they live not in the constricted present, but in the wider reaches of evolutionary time. When we hear his call, we hear no bird. We hear the trumpet in the orchestra of evolution. He is the symbol of our unattainable past, that incredible sweep of millennia, which underlies and conditions the daily affairs of birds and men. 11 of the 15 species of cranes are considered threatened or endangered all over the world. And that raises, I think, some very difficult and important questions. I think if we, and this is to conclude, and I hope I've kept within my time so that we can discuss some of the range of issues which the Mabola case raises. Issues ranging from state capture, the power of mining corporations, violence and intimidation, and desperate poverty. It raises important questions which I think we have to deal with in thinking very broadly in planetary terms and in geological time in terms of what we are facing, because what we are facing is both the extermination of all life forms. I'll leave it at that. Dineo, thanks very much, love.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for a very insightful presentation. I would now Mazibuko, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. You had gone quiet for a minute.
Please pardon me. I am struggling with load shedding. We are currently load shedded, and I had just thanked Jackie for a very insightful presentation, and I'd like to now welcome you to respond to some of the insightful, I think, perspective that Jackie has just presented to us. Please go ahead, Mazibuko.
Good afternoon to everyone. Now for the introduction and the welcome. Thanks to Jackie as well for quite present of a case study that is quite interesting from a number of perspectives. Briefly, I will speak.
Mazibuko, can you speak louder, please, love?
Okay. Briefly, I will speak to some of the 4 points I found interesting in the presentation. Jackie, in your discussion, in your presentation, you mentioned the state when it comes to the two ministers, Mabola and Msebenzi, and you also mentioned state capture. But I'm interested in a deeper digging on the role of the state. So, for example, to what extent is the provincial government and the municipality present as players, and what is their exact role? In the case of the Amadiba community in Kolobeni, there is a significant conflation. Okay, I thought Jackie was saying something. So I'm very interested in the role of the state. And then in the case of Mpumalanga, the province, there's also a state-owned entity called the Mpumalanga Development Economic Growth Agency, MIGA. In its strategic plan, it's got mining and high-level agro-processing as part of its core focus. One of its mandates is to establish special economic zones in Mpumalanga. Yeah, so that's one area of interest for me in the case that you've put forward. Also, the other aspect about the state is the desperation for jobs, which you've spoken to from the perspective of the local community. Elsewhere, where the state has really promoted mining, whether it's coal or beyond coal, it has really punted mining as a job creator without necessarily of issues that come up. This question of jobs is real because we know our chronic unemployment and affects in a path is not immediate community because of the history of conservation which led to dispossession. I can understand that. I think what that does for
Please excuse us. We are having technical glitches today. Mazibuko also indicated that he's connected from a hotel and there might be load shedded. So I think, Jackie, actually your discussion is quite timeless in that we are actually as a country undergoing load shedding and, you know, actually trying to think about the shift from the coal regime to renewable energy. And so Mazibuko, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm sorry about this challenge. So I was saying this question of jobs is quite an issue that goes beyond the interests of the state. Local communities, as Jackie has said, are pressed for livelihoods, for income, for wages. And as given the local history, where conservation has led to dispossession, it's going to be very difficult to navigate that without sustained organizing in a way that really informs, empowers, educates, and enables the local community to work out the options, the implications of coal mining vis-a-vis other options. And the challenge in that regard is that it does not seem to me that the state is going to look at other pathways to livelihoods or to jobs, or even just the basic question of food in that particular local context. But I'm saying that with a qualification. That's why I was asking earlier what the interests of the various arms of the state have been in the local area, because it will matter for how the whole debate about mining vis-a-vis other development alternatives are really understood. This debate is very present in groups such as the Mining Affected Communities United in Action. So they've got an affiliation across the country of different communities where some of the communities are asking for benefits from mining in the form of shares or development benefits from mining companies. Some of the other communities in the same network have begun to think about life beyond coal, life beyond mining. That's also very present in the Tolobeni struggle. So that kind of debate does not become easily solved without organizing, because it's organizing and action. You people be real politicians, think through, challenge with the of the alternatives issue. So what the case study brings is to underline politics.
Mazibuko, could you please switch off your video? Perhaps that might help with your connection because you are breaking on our side.
Okay, I've switched it off. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. How eco-politics is quite present in South Africa across working class communities, rural communities, townships, villages, whereas a while back, the struggle around the environment could have been easily dismissed as a struggle of a small group of environmentalists. But I think that's no longer the case. A further complexity for me, particularly in the context of Wackerstroom, is a nexus that brings into the picture land reform as well. Wackerstroom is one of those bastions of skewed land ownership, and I think there is lack of confidence on the part of broader unemployed and working people on the ability of the state to address the land issue through redistribution and other reforms that will be required to go along with that redistribution. I want to throw a question there. To what extent is the land reform issue being considered as part of the discussion in the vacation context? And then there are two other points before I step off in my response. In light of the fact that we've just emerged from local government elections, I think we do need to think about the role of the municipality, the role of the local state. We know the impact of neoliberalism on the local state. For example, the extent to which financing of the local state is based to a significant extent on the user pays by selling electricity, by selling other services, in a way that actually goes against the notion of free basic services. So there is that aspect. So that means that the local state is actually in a crisis, because how do people pay when there are massive numbers of people who are unemployed? But at the same time, the local state, in theory, is empowered to advance community-driven integrated development planning. Is there scope and space to integrate the complexity of the case study in the IDP of the municipality? That complexity speaks to development alternatives, speaks to job creation, speaks to ecological and sustainable development. How does a disparate municipality play a role and navigate that complexity? But importantly, beyond the IDP, there is also spatial planning. For example, municipalities are required to develop spatial development frameworks and also to ensure that there is effective public participation in spatial planning, and to also ensure that there is ecological sustainability actually in spatial planning. This is in law and in policy. I'm raising that it may not be currently present in the case study, but in thinking about it from an activist perspective for the long term, I think it's an opportunity that could be utilized in significant ways. The last point I want to raise in response is that of alliances that the particular local community could strike, but also this question of alliances applies across the board. Those alliances could be with similarly affected communities, but also other sections of poor and working people. And the biggest weakness here, the biggest gap, the yawning gap here is the labor movement, which in a previous moment in our history would have brought important dimensions to the discussion. The other element that is also crucial is the civic movement. Nowadays, the civic movement exists in various forms, whether it's the old civics under Sanko, independent civics, but also what has come up as crisis committees or social movements. Some of them are primarily concerned with service delivery issues, with unemployment issues, but I think it's critical that work is done with them in ways that can bring the ecological dimension into their attention. Because if it's crisis committees that are formed, or social movements that are formed in response to unemployment, it may be very easy for the carrot to be dangled and for them to bite that dangled carrot, the dangled carrot of employment through mining or through coal. So this question of alliances and sustained organizing work, I think, is critical. If we're to deepen the work that already is happening, the work of building an eco-politics from below. Thank you.
Thank you, Mazibuko. Over to you, Mashile. Mashile, can you hear us? It seems Mashile couldn't join us because of connectivity issues as well. So Jackie, I'd like to ask you to switch on your video and respond to Mazibuko's response, and then we can then open it up for questions and comments. Jackie, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks very much, Dineo, and thank you from my friend Mazibuko, whom I've known for 100 years, and I expected him to come up with a challenging response, but I'm a little bit overwhelmed by the number of issues you've raised, Mazibuko, but I will try, my friend, to deal with some of them. Firstly, and lastly, I think you have, well, said many, many important things that I agree with wholeheartedly. The notion of alliances is critical. And one of the success stories that I haven't had, I've written it in the paper, but I haven't given it time in this discussion, is the effectiveness of the coalition established by the Center for Environmental Rights, that is much more directed and sustainable than similar coalitions that have been formed around saving Mapungubwe, for example, and other national parks and protected areas threatened by coal mining. But the most effective alliance, and it even includes a local environmental justice organization. So it's not simply top down, but the strongest and most important voice on the whole very fragmented scene of energy policy at the moment is the Life Beyond Coal Alliance between Earthlife, the Center for Environmental Rights, and Groundwork. And I think those three set a wonderful example of important insights looking at the big picture in relation to all these local struggles. So I think we have a great deal to learn from their insights and their attempt to address different interest groups in the particular areas where the dynamics are often complex and unique. I think that things are changing as regards the labor scene. And the labor scene is the most fragmented the most fragmented piece of a very, very divided picture. But when the concept of a just transition was brought to South Africa by COSATU in about 2010, it was a transformative notion. It was a notion which recognized that the driver of the climate crisis is the expansive logic of capitalism, the profit-driven nature of capitalism, and the disregard for people, especially workers, and nature. And it was recognized in COSATU's policy that has been published in 2012, that capitalism is the real problem, which is something that someone like Jason Moore is saying today. It's the Capitocene, not the Anthropocene, and the power of particular corporations, which is the real problem that is facing us in terms of the immediacy of the climate crisis. So when we talk about labor today, labor has fragmented under the impact of what's been called a jobs holocaust, and has retreated, or until very recently has retreated into a defensive position of wanting to maintain existing jobs, which represents in the coal mines about 92,000 people. But it is beginning to change, and labor COSATU is at present involved in rethinking its 2012 policy, which is calling for a new economic system, a redistribution of power and resources to really make substantive changes, which takes account of land redistribution as well as employment, as well as a different attitude to nature that does no longer see nature simply as a store of resources for economic activity or a sink for our waste products, but which is building more on a traditional African notion of ecological balance, where nature is respected and we are seen as part of nature. So I think that at the moment it is a fragmented picture, but there are beginning to be important alliances of which labor is part, and then there's all the activity around the notion of climate justice. So I think that can be hopeful. As regards the state, there, I cannot answer you fully about the situation in Mpumalanga, but I get the impression that in the case of Mabola, two people have been particularly prominent in their support for Atha Utuga Energy in their promotion of the coal mining in a protected area. And the one is the Premier of Mpumalanga, and the other is Vusi Shongwe, who is the MEC. And I mean, one's got to be careful here, but it seems that is where their tactic is both, it's a clever tactic because they're working from below in terms of sowing divisions and promising, making false promises wrapped up in the discourse of development at the same time that there's a courting of officials with real power. But the truth is that the South African government is committed to extractivism. The truth is that our minister has talked about closing all the coal mines as committing economic suicide. The truth is that we cannot trust our leaders. There's talk of giving South Africa a great deal of money to convert the coal mines to renewable energy plants, billions of rands. We cannot trust them not to spend that money on nail boutiques for their daughters-in-law. We cannot trust our leaders, as has been said at Glasgow, blah, blah, blah. The truth is that the whole COP process has failed to produce any reduction, any substantial reduction in carbon emissions. So we are at a stage globally, and this is why I'm wanting to push the notion of thinking at two levels, both the concrete local level and the planetary level. We are at a stage where there is a complete lack of trust, political trust in our leaders. And in South Africa, we have to be asking some very tough questions about ourselves, because we produce something like over 254 million tons of coal a year, of which 70 million is exported mainly to India. So we are contributing to the climate problem. And the notion of a just transition as a transformative, revolutionary document it's been captured by elite forces who have shrunk it to mean simply a shift to a new energy regime. So that is something we need to fight for. We need to reclaim. COSATU is rethinking its defensive, protective position of the past and seeing this as an opportunity for people to realize that capitalism as a system is neither just nor sustainable, and that we have to be thinking of something completely different. And in relation to your issue about jobs, Mazibuko, it cannot be jobs, because the new economy globally cannot provide the jobs for everyone. So we have to be thinking about universal income grants, different livelihoods, different possibilities for people to lead decent lives and develop the capacities they have to contribute. So I don't want to go on too long, because I want to give other people a chance to come in and try and answer some of the very good questions that Mazibuko has raised. But I think we are in a situation of crisis. And it is very, very difficult, I think, to try to look to the cause of the problem to provide the solutions. And that is what happened at Glasgow. And that is what is happening both in South Africa and globally. Capitalism is the cause of the problem. It cannot provide the answers, whether it is more efficient carbon markets or financial support to the global north, the global south.
Thank you for that response, Jackie. We have about 30 minutes for an open discussion. So you're welcome to raise your hand or type in your comment or question in our Q&A section. I will take about 2 to 3 questions, then you can respond, Jackie. I saw a hand from Professor Eddie Webster. Please, over to you.
Thank you. Actually, that was a mistake. I'm just listening attentively to Jackie's fascinating talk. And at the moment, I don't have a specific question. Thank you.
In other words, waving, not drowning.
There is a question from Sharon Fawn. She says, given the so-called agreement coming out of the COP meeting, the money for a just transition in South Africa that has been donated, is there an opportunity here, a system whereby community level activism holds the government to account about how that money is spent? It seems that if we give up on our ability to hold government to account, we give up South Africa, and how to create a coalition that is able to do this. So I think she's really asking about, whether there is an opportunity here to actually hold the government to account now, given that we have received the funds, or at least there is a promise of those funds which have been pledged at the COP meeting. I would like to just take a few hands, and Jackie, you can respond afterwards. Well, Eddie, you can put your hand down. Jackie, there aren't questions at this point. Would you like to speak to that point that was raised?
Having come from Europe, you're in a better position to understand their thinking than I am. But I think that young people who are demanding system change, not climate change, are having a very powerful effect. But I think that our leaders live in a bubble of privilege, so that for them to make promises, they've made many promises in the past that have not materialized. The only possibility to secure that money, the billions that they're talking about, giving to South Africa to help convert, again, they're speaking the language which is a diminished language, a shrunken language of the just transition, simply to mean renewable energy and not something totally transformative, to use the opportunity for people to recognize capitalism has failed and to address the problems of unemployment and poverty at the same time. But I don't think we have that capacity, which is why I think that we are in such trouble. I don't think we have. I think the anger is building up. I think the election shows the total lack of trust in the present leadership. I think the overseas donor organizations do not like ring fencing money, But I think to do so is to go along with the idea that we can create a new mythical green capitalism that is less polluting, but still maintains the levels of inequality that are so savage and so devastating for so many millions of people. So I wouldn't like to say South Africa's lost, but I think we're in deep, deep, deep trouble. You want to come back at me?
Thank you for that, Jackie. We have a comment that people are really appreciating the session and the great paper that you have given. And I just wanted to perhaps abuse my power as a chair and say, I think, I mean, in the news today, I've just heard Gwede Mantashe, who's actually saying that that we can actually move from the coal regime, because I think of the amount that has been spent actually to build all these power stations that are here. So we actually have a government which sometimes swings towards green energy, but at the same time, because of the concern about jobs, swings back. And so I'm just wondering from your perspective, Jackie, whether you feel that we have the kind of leadership that is necessary actually to make this transition to renewable energy. I think you can respond, Jackie, because I don't see many hands from our participants. So you could respond to that, and we'll then open it up again. We have about 20 minutes. So again, please, you're welcome to post your Q&As, I mean, your questions as well as comments, and we'll take it from there. Jackie, over to you.
No, thanks, Dineo. It's a good question, and in a way, no, I certainly have no confidence in this government at all. But I also have lost confidence in our ability to really formulate, which is why I talked about the need for a new eco-politics, which is something, we've got an extraordinary opportunity to accept that we need to change our economic system. And I can understand that for many people, socialism is discredited because it's associated with abuse of human rights and what has gone wrong in many, socialist experiments. I can understand why people see environmentalism as a white person's concern. One of the informants that I wanted to quote from, and I forgot, talked about the cranes, and he said how his words were, we are not allowed to eat them, even though we are hungry. And that is a legacy of the past and the way environmentalism has become contaminated by its abuse under apartheid. So I think without trust, and linked to COVID, by the way, and the way COVID has eroded social bonds and social connections, I think that it's going to be very, very difficult, because even the move to renewable energy, if this money comes and it is ring-fenced, and unless we can mobilize the citizenry on a massive, massive scale, as Sharon was suggesting, it is not going to address the levels of inequality, which is the real issue in our society, which requires something very different, because renewable energy is not labor intensive. And unless we manufacture our own components instead of importing from large international, multinational companies, unless we can site them in places like near Mabola, where they provide jobs for local people. The jobs are in construction, they're not in maintenance. So we could have green energy, Sharon, but Eddie, maybe you would say something about whether it is possible remotely to provide jobs for everybody, given the levels of technology that we have access to at present, which is why we have to be talking about work in a different way.
Professor Eddie Webster, unfortunately, you cannot leave our seminar not having said anything. So I'd like to invite you to actually respond to Jackie's question.
Muted. Can you hear me?
Eddie, it's a simple question. Can we provide jobs for everyone?
Yeah. Okay, I'll take up the challenge, Jackie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I was just really quietly absorbing your argument with a glass of wine. So I'm not sure if I'm really well positioned to answer your question, but if I'm understanding the logic of your argument, and that is that we can't simply talk about renewable energy, but we have to think about, if you like, an anti-capitalist alternative. I mean, the question that I with the webinar is, in what social forces would drive such an organization, such a movement? What organizations, what social forces, and where would it come from? Does your research, Jackie, point towards that? You talk about an alliance and eco-politics. Are you suggesting that could mount? Those are the kinds of social. You also mentioned labor, a shift. Is that how you see this alternative forces emerging? So that's the question I have, Jackie.
Well, the answer is you ducking the question which I put to you, but I think that, and look, there's a lot of evidence from even a country as corrupt in many ways as the States, that the majority of people believe that capitalism is not working. It does not provide people with the ability to develop the capacities they need to establish what they define as a good life. And I think the idea that everyone should be living well and not better than others, I think that these can have an appeal to people, to a range of social forces, from the bottom up, from people who are hungry and desperate, from people who are privileged and living with high levels of extravagant consumption, that life could be easier if there was less fear, if there was less competition, if we were less atomized and competitive. And I think a good example of how the idea of a different society could appeal to people, because when I look at what has happened to the university, for example, and I leave Wits at the end of, well, I've been there for over 40 years, and I've seen how people are less happy because they are under pressure, under increasing pressure to produce, to compete, to compete with their colleagues rather than to collaborate with them. So that I think that capitalism does not, leaving out all the questions about people's basic human needs, I think people are not happy, most people. It is creating, and it's been helped by COVID, it's made people retreat into more private concerns and personal worlds rather than sharing. So I think the notions, well, to me, there are 3 S's which I believe in, and they are simplicity, solidarity, and sharing. And I think that those are things which could appeal to most people, that we need change, and it has to be change that is more than a new energy regime, which could end up being just as exploitative as our previous carbon capitalism, if it only benefits the few. So I think that the labor movement is beginning to change. Certainly COSATU, which went through its bad times, is rethinking its position and looking at its 212 statements about how the expansive logic of capitalism is what is driving the climate crisis. I think increasing numbers of all kinds of people realize that we are threatened with extinction of all life forms. But I think the other idea, which could be quite powerful, is for people to realize that we have a strong African tradition whereby Ubuntu does not only mean connecting with other people, that it opens up the possibility of connecting with other life forms. And the idea of breaking with the colonial dualistic thinking of nature and society as quite separate, and instead seeing the world as more integrated, could lead us to something powerful, given that the present reality is not working, it is not sustainable, it is not just. I think surely most people accept that, but they think it's Tina, that there is no possible alternative. And I think that we, in our situation, this is what we have to create, but it could be something that comes out of our African experience that values all forms of life and is concerned with balance and fairness and respect and reciprocity, and moves away from the individualist, atomized, competitive present that we live in.
Thank you for that, Jackie. I have comments here, but also questions from Pushani, who says, do we have any experiences of alternatives outside of the kinds of organizing we know or expect that are already producing life without waged work? Jackie and Dineo, you've argued in a recent paper that women, through their solidarity, were able to offer the increased need for care and support under COVID in the absence of state and other forms of income support. Are these just creating an additional unseen burden for women, or do they suggest possibilities for real alternatives? We've got Nomsa Kanye also stating her concerns, really, and saying, but will affected communities benefit in all this, because now our government is untrustable and we are really worried about our community. We have human-built mountains surrounding us. Will there be a change or the funds will just disappear without helping the poor communities? And we've got Dineo Elizabeth, who says, with the outcomes of the latest local elections, do you think that the eco-politics would apply fairly in this dispensation or coalitions? And we also have others really who are just thanking us, thanking you really, Jackie, for a very insightful presentation. I'd like to bring back Mazibuko to this discussion for you to give your comments or response to, some of the questions or comments that have been raised, and then to give it back to you, Jackie, after his response, so that you can wrap up for us, because we have about at least 10 minutes. Mazibuko, over to you.
Thank you. In response to a part of Prashani's question, there are interesting experiments on the ground in Bondeyevel, in some of the settlements Abahlali and Pasim Jondolo is organizing, in the productive activities of people in the former homelands, particularly, for example, in Amadiba. Those basically have been about the basic provisioning of food through urban agriculture, but also even socially constructed kitchens. I think those are still quite nascent, still quite rudimentary. For me, given the impact of COVID on jobs and given the need for food as a basic need, there's a lot of organizing that can happen in that sphere. There must be many other examples, but all of those examples have not yet reached a critical mass such that there's actually communities of practice. There is even economically a social weight that begins to change things. But also those experiments do require a social weight that at this point in time has to come from the state, has to come from the public tax, has to come from a particular form of organizing the state, particularly when it comes to education, when it comes to health, when it comes to transport and electricity, and probably a few other basic needs like that. So I don't think we can think of the possible alternatives outside of the notion of a bigger social wage. Dineo's question, look, I think the local state is key. The coalitions, I think it's early days to work out the extent to which they'll open up space. Whether there are coalitions or not, though, I think there is a need for sustained organizing focused on the local state in quite a significant way. The last thing I want to comment on is a point Jackie had mentioned about the state and also that question about this agreement with the US and the UK about the provisioning of finance to finance a transition in South Africa. I agree with the comments that Jackie has made. But if we're the radical government, one of the things which will be key is whether we can mobilize financial resources from within our own economy. And of course now, with the economy having suffered in the way it has, and also with austerity being dominant, the state is not oriented to that. But does that mean progressive forces should not pay attention to this question? For example, there is the Development Bank of Southern Africa. There is the National Skills Fund, which has on probably about 10 billion rands on an annual basis in its annual budget. And this money is supposed to go to communities and workers and skills development money. And there are probably other public development financial institutions at provincial levels and so on. Now, we're not sufficiently organized at various levels, locally, nationally, and so on, to be able to demand that money goes to cooperatives, goes to renewable energy options, goes to other kinds of climate jobs initiatives or other climate work initiatives. So there's still a lot of work on our part to really build the kind of critical social weight that can impact on the state, such that even financing goes beyond the limits that Jackie was pointing to with regards to this agreement.
Thank you, Mazibuko. Jackie, just before you respond, there's also another question to consider. This is from Marie, who says, who's asking whether you think there's a role in this transition away from capitalism for the creative arts, and if so, what forms this role could take, which is quite really an interesting question and really food for thought. I'd like to invite you, Jackie, to respond to the comments and some of the questions that have been raised, and perhaps also give us your closing remarks.
Gosh, yeah, there's it's great to be having this conversation. I think that I'm having trouble because it cuts out a bit, but if I understand the last question, I think there are examples all around us of building blocks for a new eco-feminist socialist society. And that's what I argue for in much of what I do. And those building blocks are, as Comrade Mazibuko said, a lot of them are to do with food sovereignty. A lot of them are to do with energy democracy. A lot of them are to do with cooperatives of different kinds. So these are examples of where people are working together in a harmonious way. But I would bring it back to my own experience, because I had an extremely formative experience of 5 years working in Botswana, where I saw relations as I have never seen them in a capitalist society, where relations were built on trust and sharing and solidarity. And I think that was for two reasons. The one was that everybody earned the same, from the principal to, I can't say cleaner because we had to do our own cleaning work and we had to take it in turns to clean the lavatories or do whatever was necessary to do. And I think that earning the same, reducing the incredible, obscene wage gap and the inequality and envy and anger and contempt for the poor, which it is breeding, I think that is something toxic in our society. And until we can face up to that and arrive at some common political alternative, some newer political imaginary, we are in deep trouble. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for those comments. And thank you, Dineo. You make an excellent chair. And thank you for Mazibuko for your thoughtfulness. And I'm sorry about our other comrades, but it's something about our society, the load shedding. It's a symptom of how we're falling apart and the frustrations and disconnections which we experience in our social relations as a result.
Thank you so much. And please follow us on Twitter as well as Facebook for updates about our upcoming events. Thank you, Jackie, and thank you so much, Mazibuko, for an excellent discussion and really insightful. And as I've said, very timeless in considering, the current political climate that we find ourselves in South Africa. With that, I'd like to close and have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Mazibuko and Busu.
Thanks, Mazibuko. Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Dineo. Hey?
Thank you.
We were able to put it through despite the challenges with the electricity.
Yeah. It was quite challenging, particularly on my side, because I kept getting disconnected and reconnected again. Yeah, so yeah, I'm glad that at least for the speakers that wasn't the case.
Yeah, but all went well. Thanks.
Yeah, I thought the attendance was also good. Thank you so much, Mazibuko, and thanks, Muso. Yeah, very helpful. Thank you so much.
Maybe let's just wait for everyone to leave and let's remain Dineo, me, and Tez to chat about that. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm also just trying to stop the live stream.
Oh, yes.
Oh, it's you have to do it, Mbuso. Unless you make me the host.
So no, the